Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher from Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University and thanks for joining us. I'm excited today because today's topic actually comes directly from the audience. A listener suggested having an episode about what can be done to restore old and neglected ponds. This is a great topic because I frequently receive calls from landowners that have just purchased their dream property and are really excited because they have a pond or multiple ponds on the property. Most of the time, those ponds were built and stocked a long time ago with little management attention in recent years. This is a great topic because I'm sure a lot of the listeners have faced this similar dilemma. Well, I listen to my audience, so please feel free to suggest more topics. To address this issue of old neglected ponds, I've invited Mark Griffith to join me and have a conversation. Mark is a private lands biologist with his own company, Ichthys Pond Management, LLC. He's been renovating old ponds like this for some time. Mark, welcome to Fish University.
Thanks, Wes. Excited to chat with you today.
But let's talk a little bit about what you do, your business, and how long you've been doing this.
What I do is mostly consulting, but reach back to, 30-something years of fishery research. It started in about 1992 there at Mississippi State, Dr. Jackson, and hanging out with Marty Brunson, doing some pond management stuff while I was, there getting an undergraduate. And fast forward, it's taken me to a nice career with the federal government doing ag research, but I'm always been able to do this consulting on the side. And then past 12 years ago or so, I was able to start an LLC. So in 2011, I started Ichthys Pond Management, got permission from the federal government to do sideline business, and built a shocking boat, stay in private waters, and just reached back to 30 some odd years experience to help put the pieces of the puzzle together. Like you said, to try to take an old pond or a new piece of land and develop a lake, and just take the known pieces of the puzzle and see the latest, greatest innovation, species, feeders, the whole pond management scheme, and apply that to different properties. And it's been a blast.
Yeah, and I know you and I have collaborated some with both pond workshops here in the state of Mississippi, and on a few ponds where people have called me and asked about this very question, which is, I just bought this property, I have an old pond, I want to know what to do with it, I'd like to have somebody come look at it. And I've oftentimes sent them to you because I know that that's your expertise and you love doing it. So what a great topic for you and I to discuss today.
I appreciate that from you, Wes. With your background, that means a lot to come in on your recommendation.
So let's jump right into it. People call and they say, I have an old pond, they have a neglected pond. What exactly does that mean? And, how did the pond become an old neglected pond?
Yeah, after the initial introduction, they say they've got an old pond. That's a relative term. I mean, it could be a year, it could be 50 years. I start with that. We're just trying to dig up as much history as possible. And yeah, you mentioned an old pond. You mentioned before neglect. It made me neglect that it was, in a pasture, and now it's grown up. We may call it neglect. It's just going through its natural, somebody dammed it up, and it's, there's trees or sedimentation, silt, buildup of organic matter. So I guess that would be the old pond scenario.
Yeah, and a lot of times these ponds are, somebody built it, somebody had this great idea, they were going to build a lake, they stocked it, maybe they fished it for a few years, then they may have gotten sick, they may have just gotten sidetracked with life, and that pond has been left relatively unmanaged for anywhere from a year to, sometimes decades. Then the person decides to sell the property, or they move, and somebody new inherits the property or purchases the property. And what they find is this lake that's hidden out in the woods. It's been relatively untouched for years. Maybe it's got sedimentation problems, like you mentioned. Maybe it's got vegetation problems. Maybe it has forest debris that's built up in it and organic matter. Certainly it could have issues with the levee. But a lot of times the problems I see are water quality, and in particular, fish community completely out of balance because it's not been fished, right? So if they've neglected it, as we say, or they haven't been managing it for years and years, if you're not harvesting fish and maintaining that balance between predators and prey, things go awry pretty quickly. So I guess, that's what I deal with a lot of times when people say I have an old pond. I've seen ponds, heck, what is it? Richmond Mill Pond in North Carolina that's famous for its massive bluegill. That's an old pond. That thing's hundreds of years old.
Absolutely. Well, you just talked about the fish community, and that's the first question I usually get. We'll walk up to the property and they may have, just purchased it or inherited it or just, noticed the pond in the woods. They want to know what's in it right away. Before they even fish it, they want to put a shocking boat in it and make it the best fishery ever, and then you start telling them about sedimentation, organic matter, water quality, watershed boundary, and, nutrient loads and carrying capacities. It can be overwhelming, but, the pieces hadn't changed that much from, like you said, the Richmond Mill Pond. I mean, that's a perfect scenario for the high flow through spring pond that some people say, it just won't work with the flush nutrients. Well, with our supplemental feed and putting those pieces of the puzzle together, I mean, it's still one that, as far as I know, it still produces.
And you mentioned something I think that was very important there, and that is they want to know what's in it, and they've never cast a line. If you're listening to this and you own a pond, please don't call me and say, I'd like to know what's in my pond. You have the ability to find out what's in your pond. You just need to take a rod and reel down to the pond, put on a couple different lure sizes, and try to fish a little bit, because a lot of times people don't even do that before they call professional help. And most of the time you can tell the pond's in pretty good shape and you don't need to get extensions help or private consultants help. All you need to do is find out what you have and then start managing. Now, obviously, if you go down to that lake and you're throwing a 12-inch worm on a Texas rig, you're not going to see what all's there unless there's a big fish. But throw lures of different sizes, throw something that can catch bluegill, something that can catch small bass. If crappie are in there, you'll find out. Go out and explore the pond and then figure out what's there on your own, and then determine if, based on your personal management objectives, whether or not you need professional help. That'll save you a lot of money and a lot of heartache.
You're right. And, that's always a key component is give me some fishing records. But then you ask what kind of, what do you usually fish with and when do you fish? It's just like now, you catch more fish hook and line than electrofishing. I've already parked my boat for the season. So, they say they want that boat in there to shock. And I say, we can catch more hook and line, or watch your feeders in the morning or evening will tell us more about what's going on.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's MSSTATE.edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show. So let's talk about these ponds that have been unmanaged for a while. We've mentioned some of the problems that they can have, like sedimentation, like the fish community out of balance. What about genetics? When you don't harvest fish for a long time, the fish community has been established. Let's say it's a 50-year-old pond. Do you worry about genetics at all?
Oh, absolutely. You can drop hints like the Sri Lanka, the slab lab, how they're tracing genetics back, getting away from that I think Bob would call it bucket biology. I call it bubble stocking, and you get good genetics and select for that. Because still in a new pond or renovation, your fish and stocking, it's probably going to be one of the cheapest components. To get those good genetics in and be able to work with that in your management plan, oh yeah, it's top four. You get the water and your habitat and age, then you've got those genetics it's a key component.
And let's talk about the water and the habitat. Let's talk about water first and water quality. A lot of times with these older ponds, I've noticed that they tend to be often tannic or very poor water chemistry. I don't know if that's just because it's been years and they needed lime. They were limed at one point in time. They haven't been limed in decades. Or if that's a factor that's related to the addition of organic matter. Where I live, it's a lot of pine forests, but oftentimes see very clear tea-stained waters that are not very productive.
Oh yeah. That's the first step, whether a new lake or old lake. You got to have water. You got to be able to hold water. And then you look at the chemistry, and it's going to be directly related to the surrounding area. Soil types, the surrounding watershed, is it forested? Is it old growth? Is it pines? Is it pasture? Recently developed property that may have a little different inflow than it has been. So one of my first things I do is I pull that whole watershed boundary, not only to get the watershed to surface area ratio, but to see what's out there and really zoom in on a satellite image and try to get those components to let me know what's flowing into this water body. And then the water chemistry, work that out and just develop your carrying capacity, your nutrient retention time, what you're able to do with that body of water before you go the next step.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Particularly the watershed surface area ratio is something that anybody who's managing a pond for the first time should have that checked out, because these ponds were built a long time ago. Who knows if they have a small watershed to surface area ratio, they may not hold water or not have enough water supply. And if they have too much, they may just flush out or even have risk of erosion of the dam. You may need to come in and add support or reinforce the emergency spillway. Certainly it's going to affect your ability to retain good water quality lime that you add to it. If you fertilize, to keep the fertilizer in the lake. So knowing that in the beginning is a good place to start, because so many factors of the lake and its productivity depend on its water supply. And a good rule of thumb I like to tell people when they ask me if their pond needs to be limed, before they ever submit a water sample, submit a soil sample, which are both great ways to determine that, I just tell them, look, if your pastures or your garden needs to be limed, chances are your pond does too.
Absolutely.
Because your water quality is really determined by the geology of the area. If you're in the Mississippi Delta, chances are you probably don't need to lime your pond. But if you're in a coastal plain area or some place that doesn't have a lot of natural limestone or other calcium and carbonate compounds, you're probably going to need lime.
Oh yeah, especially here in Northeast Mississippi, that's a huge limiting factor of nutrient retention. And you'll probably use that 500-pound water. A lot of times, I'm stuck at 300-pound water. I can't get that nutrient just because of our, need for lime, our alkalinities, our soil types up here. A little bit further over there in North Alabama, it's better. But here in North Mississippi, we get limited just by our watershed makeup.
Yeah, Mark, the listeners may not understand what you mean by 300-pound and 500-pound water. You want to explain that?
Okay, I'm looking at a total biomass for that water. Kind of like what can we grow in your garden? I start putting the pieces of the puzzle together for a body of water, and I'm looking at the structure, not cover, but structure, deep water, shallow water, where you can get, you're going to like this, groceries. So all the prey species I refer to a lot of time as groceries, and then you got your predators, the other component. And then you can break that predator-prey relationship down to, 15, 20% predator, the rest prey, so groceries and predator. And then you apply that per acre. So, you get so many pounds per acre. Get you an idea to start with, because then when you apply a management plan, it'll help determine how many pounds per acre to take out of bass. Because Joe's pond, you may tell him 15 and 20, where, Steve's pond, just down the road, he may be at 75 to 100 pounds per acre. It's hard to describe.
I would summarize it as, your 500-pound water, think about it as 50 or 75 pounds of bass per acre, and then 450 to 425 pounds of prey per acre, because for every pound of prey that's eaten, it only makes about a tenth of a pound of bass. You lose a lot of that energy through the activity of catching the prey, the activity of consuming the prey, the activity of digesting the prey. Then some of that energy is lost through the feces and through the ammonia, and eventually you end up with, what little bit of energy is left over from all the biological processes. You end up with some of it going to reproduction and some of it going to growth. And as a general rule of thumb, about 10% of it goes to growth.
I have to be careful saying pounds per acre per surface acre, because as well as I do, there's some places in that lake or pond that are kind of unproductive. Just because it's 10 acres doesn't always mean, you can apply certain things over the complete 10 acres, like stocking grass carp or something like that. A lot of times I'll break that down and look at how much of it is actually productive water in that. If we got 20 or 30 feet some places without some decent currents, then that's kind of unproductive water.
That's what they call the 90-10 rule, right? 90% of the fish are in 10% of the water.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I blame my inability to catch fish. I'll go, well, I just didn't find that 10%. Well, today's electronics, they rule that out. And we're talking about, these old ponds. I've got the latest Garmin side scan. It tells me so much about habitat below the surface. Now, I'm still looking at siltation rates and stuff, but I'm able to see old brim beds, new brim beds, just stuff like that different component that, didn't look closely at before. And it's useful too, as well as the live scope with crappie, trying to, we're playing with the hybrid crappie, and, we want to go electrofish, but a lot of times you can't get those crappie if they're not shallow. And that's where that live scope comes in. They'll drop in on them, and, you go see those larger ones. Yeah, you may only get one out of those four, but then that's such a useful sampling tool.
So we've covered some of the issues with old ponds, from the predator-prey balance. We talked about genetics, water quality. Weeds are a big problem. We could spend multiple episodes on weeds. I'd like to talk a little bit about organic matter buildup and some of the problems that come with that, because a lot of times these ponds have been sitting back in the woods. Leaf litter and branches have been falling in them for years, and everybody thinks about branches as habitat, but when they're covered in leaves, they come in and you've got a lot of organic matter building up. That can cause problems as well, right?
Absolutely. And that's tough because, the upper end of some of these ponds, the way they were built, we call them a gully plug. So they just dammed it up. And once they got their ball pit and they got the dirt off the ridges, they just let the back end fill as however the relief, called for it. So, yeah, we can get 20 years of leaf litter back there. And there's just so much that goes on. Now, we ask, can you put the aeration in it? Can you help break that down? Does it go anoxic? Once you get sediment on leaf litter, that's a huge component in how it affects water quality. At the sedimentation lab on the 9 to 5, we study all the harmful algal blooms. That's several episodes in itself right there to see how it impacts a fishery, the water body.
Put you on the spot here for a second. What's your opinion of the bacterial amendments for ponds? Bacteria in a bottle that you can pour into a pond that makes claims it reduces organic matter and improves water quality.
It looks good on paper. Okay, the only way I'm familiar by researching it from the producers what they claim, and all the chemistry's there. The principles absolutely are there. But I hadn't seen it firsthand. I've seen it work in a few. Somebody tells me this is what they applied it and it helped, but I hadn't seen long term yet. And if there's that much muck, then usually there's another underlying factor. I think your aeration, if you can break that stratification, then stuff's supposed to break down.
With me, I have three problems with it. The first problem is that the bacteria that are being sold are already present in the pond. So it's not like you're adding something
True.
new to the pond. The second problem is that bacteria do not live very long in a bottle on a shelf. Unless you're buying, there's a few companies out there that are making custom mixes that are fresh and sent directly to the consumer. In that case, you probably are getting a lot of active bacteria. But the third problem I have is that the typical underlying sediment of a pond is usually, let's say, 10% organic matter. And that organic matter is the only thing the bacteria is going to act on. So in a best case scenario, you might reduce, if it had 100% effectiveness on eliminating organic matter, you might add a half an inch to pond depth. So I think you're right that, to me, aeration provides the oxygen that's necessary for the existing bacteria to do the job. And if you don't have aeration, then even bacteria in a bottle really aren't going to be very effective.
Well, let's go to aeration and mixing. Most places mix naturally. So unless you have the proper geometry, high sides deep to where you can actually turn it, then I'm not a strong component of putting a bunch of aerators in our 8-foot ponds that we have.
Yeah.
6 and 8 feet water, we get mixing there. So, yeah.
And natural lakes, they've done all right for millions of years. If you have a history of fish kills, that's a different story. You're using the aeration for something other than just improving the organic matter in the pond. But I think with aeration, that brings us on to some of the things we can do to try to correct these ponds that have been left neglected for a long period of time. So let's talk about some of the things we can do to improve ponds, in particular to improve fishing in these ponds, because most of the time these ponds are out of balance, usually bass crowded down here in Mississippi, but I have seen lakes that are brim crowded in other scenarios. Let's talk about what we can do to recover these lakes. The first thing that the landowner needs to do is to set realistic objectives for what they want from the pond, keeping in mind that you can't have everything, right?
You're right.
I got a call from a guy not long ago, and he had like a 3-acre pond. And he said, well, I want to be able to catch 10-pound bass, I want to catch 1-pound brim, and I want to catch big slab crappie. You just can't have all those things. It's a balance out there. And generally speaking, when you have a few bass and lots of prey, your bass get big, but your prey stays small. And if you have a lot of bass and few prey, your prey get big, but your bass stays small. And then when you throw crappie into a little pond like that, everybody generally stays small eventually because the crappie tend to compete with both bass and bluegill. So there are ways to get around that with crappie, but you just can't have the best of all three worlds.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, we can push those components, and I think it was Bob Luss. You can money whip it, and you can buy big fish, but it's going to be a shot in the arm. It's just going to be a quick fix. It's a balancing act, but like I tell people, it's your aquarium, and I'll use my experience to try to line up the components. I like the way you said a realistic goal. Realistic. I'm going to use that because, there's no absolute. So don't say, you can't do this here or it won't happen. But still, you got to be realistic.
And often the goals across the South in general is usually I want bigger bass. So these ponds, these old neglected ponds, are oftentimes bass crowded because there's been no harvest for years or maybe longer. The bass continue to reproduce and nobody's taking them out, so they eat up all the prey. They become prey limited. They don't grow very fast. They get thin. They can even become reproductive at smaller sizes, which is another story for another episode. But how do we go about trying to correct a bass crowded pond in ways that can be effective?
If we could do that, that would be a game changer. Because very few times can I get that population of bass down low enough and get my groceries high enough to get consistent quality bass without Mother Nature throwing me a turnover or something, but we just can't kill enough bass. And like you said, too many times people think that little 10-inch bass is just a young one. It's not, there's several thousand eggs right there.
Yeah.
So they get stunted, and there's a lot of females. It's hard to catch up. And I don't know of hardly any bass crowded scenarios that I've gotten turned around.
And that 10-inch bass you mentioned, she might be 4 or 5 years old and have been stunted at that size for a long time. Let's say you could reduce the bass population 90%. She still lost 4 good years of growth. She's never going to be able to reach her potential.
That's right.
Recovering bass crowded ponds is just hard. It's hard to do. There are things that, depending on what your objectives are, again, there are things you can do. And I like to call it thinking outside the bass.
Outside the bass.
Yeah, you've got a bass crowded situation. Just listen to the last episode with the slab lab. They're growing 2 to 3 pound bluegill because they're focusing on the prey and not on the predators. If you've got a bass crowded pond, you've got a lot of predators that are cropping down the prey. There's opportunities to grow bigger bluegill. There are some opportunities there to use that bass crowded situation to control crappie reproduction. There are other things that can be done that could produce a quality fishery, depending on if you're willing to modify your objectives.
Absolutely. I want to say within the past 3 years, when you look at a body of water for somebody and it's bass crowd, it's 3 options. Complete renovation, trophy bluegill, or do you want to go with the crappie scenario? That third scenario would be if you want to leave that stock in there, then you need to have enough potential to change with habitat, with water quality, supplemental feeding. Do you have enough leeway in those other components and reduce some bass to maybe have something exciting to mess with for the next 4 or 5 years with no guarantees? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the key. The last thing you said is the key. There's no guarantees with pond management in general, but really trying to restore an existing community that's out of balance. It's hard to do. You could waste years and untold amounts of money. Oftentimes, it's just best to start over. And I struggle with landowners all the time. I don't know what it is, but people are just really against killing out their fish and starting over. Now, I know there's a financial component of that. Some of the things we're going to talk about can get quite expensive. But a lot of times it's not the money as much as they don't want to wait 3 years to start catching fish of quality size again. But sometimes starting over is the one way we can almost guarantee success. So that's usually what these older ponds need, a complete renovation where you go in, you poison out the fish, get rid of everything, or drain the pond. If you can drain the pond, that's the way to go too. If your levee's in need of repair, then just cut the levee and build it back. You can do things within the watershed at this point when the water's drained, the organic matter's built up. You've got problems with shallow water areas that's leading to weeds, water quality issues. Draining that lake and getting heavy equipment in there and retooling the bottom and deepening the bottom and then driving a spreader truck with lime around, you're almost guaranteeing success. Whereas trying to recover the fish population through angling, it's kind of like trying to control wild pig populations with hunting. You're just not going to do it.
That's right.
Largemouth bass, they have, as you said, a small bass might have 2,000 eggs and a big bass might have 8,000 eggs. And you've got hundreds of bass. They're going to replace themselves as fast as you can take them out. And that's the problem we've run into. So starting over is not an appealing option, but it's usually the best one.
Yeah, and we've gotten it down now to where we use siphons to get the water just low enough, and rotenone still $100 a gallon, and we can kill those pretty cheap. And then you can do moderate modifications in that. If you get the water down 4 to 5, maybe 6 feet, you can get in there for a week's worth of time on some heavy equipment and really take care of those shallow areas and change some habitat in that upper end rather than cutting the dam, doing a new core, unless you have questionable dam, unless you have seeps that have developed over time. So we've gotten to where we deal with a lot of muskrat damage where they burrow in at water level. So we'll pull those water bodies down just low enough to excavate what we need to and then build back. And while it's down, we're able to do a lot of shoreline modifications for fairly cheaper than your full on complete reset. But it's a lot easier to sell that complete renovation now with these growth rates from these good genetics. It's amazing. And I don't know, I hate to go out on a limb here, but per surface acre, $750 an acre to stock a lake? If you got a 5 acre lake, that's only cost you about 2 days of heavy machinery. And that's with a decent bluegill and, a bass of your choice mixing in.
Yeah. And you mentioned the issues with the levee. A lot of these old ponds, they're neglected so long that you have trees growing on the levee. And of course, we recommend that we never let trees grow on the levee because their roots undermine the integrity and the structure of the levee. However, if you've got a lake and you've got trees and those trees are bigger than about 6 inches in diameter, you absolutely don't want to come in and cut those trees down because the roots have already penetrated. If you've got little brush growing on there, 2-3 inches in diameter, you can cut those down, poison them off. But anything bigger than that, you don't want to do that, or else you're going to have to retool the whole levee because it's going to destabilize with all those roots that are going to decompose. So you think about a root like a pipe, and when that root decomposes and breaks down, suddenly you've got an open pipe going through the dam. Just something to think about with these old lakes.
That's right. And we could do another hour-long podcast just on dam rehabs, just because they built those back slopes were so steep. And you get some trees and organic matter on, you put heavy equipment on there, and they scratch down and hit a seep, you may make a divot 2 foot deep, and then you've opened that seep up. So I hate to scare anybody with an older pond, but get some consulting on tree removal and some of your dam renovations.
So we've told people now about a way to remove the fish, to work on the dam, deepen the edges, because usually, as you said, the problem areas are the shallow areas. So if you brought the water level down 5 feet, as long as it's dried out enough to get the equipment in there, and those upper ends areas that are 2 feet deep and edges that may not have a 3-to-1 slope that may be real shallow and conducive to weed growth, you can fix that while you get the water level down. If you have weed problems, this is a good time to get in there and scrape away the areas the weeds are growing, deepen the water. Remember that anytime the water is deeper than about 3 foot deep, as long as you've got a decent phytoplankton bloom, it's usually not enough sunlight penetrates for the weeds to grow, so you can deepen those edges to eliminate weed problems. And then this is a great chance to do basin redesign. And I know, Mark, you're a big fan of habitat for fish. And habitat is both things like trees and brush piles, but it's also things like points and humps and channels and troughs and creek channels. This is a great chance to move dirt around, basically. So if you take the dirt out of the shallow upper end, maybe you make a little islands or a point or a fishing pier or, in some way, just different changes in terrain, right?
Absolutely. If those unwanted shallow areas, if we can get that water down low enough to get some decent equipment in there, we make earthen piers. You can take that muck and pile it up, allow for compaction. You don't have to haul it off. I love cattails, pickerel weed, duck potato. That's great nursery habitat. We're still hand placing a lot of brush limbs around posts. We're, making areas 15 to 20 feet by 20 feet, just piling limbs around posts, tethering them off. Neat design I need to show you that we've come up with. Pretty exciting to fish over. And just adding those, it's like a golf course. We're strategically placing those around brim beds, ambush points for bass. We think it increases our biomass while increases the fishability. You're no longer waiting until right before dark to go fish topwater down that one bank. You've got several structures that are holding fish.
With the brush piles, you mentioned a large brush pile, 20 feet in diameter. I mean, it's better to have complex multi-structures than one cedar tree by itself. That cedar tree by itself probably isn't going to hold fish, but a big pile, and you don't want to have the whole lake. I drive past lakes that are, they're standing timber standing throughout the whole lake. If you've got structure everywhere, where do you fish? Remember that a lot of times that structure is designed as much for you as it is for the fish. And if you can cast anywhere and hit a tree, then chances are the fish can be spread out. But if you've got that one good brush pile per acre, then you know where to fish. And have it marked.
Oh yeah, and have them marked. I've looked in some fishery log books before. The post coming up, they'll even put a license plate on it. In the journal, it says, we caught 2 big fish off of Florida, or Wisconsin hadn't produced a fish all year. Don't waste your time putting limbs back on it.
You mentioned log books. One of the things I like to tell people is get an old mailbox and put it beside the pond, and keep your log book, a measuring board, and a flask of whiskey right there by the pond. That way you encourage people to record their catch.
Well, you don't want it to get any more exaggerated than it already is sometimes, Yeah, the basin redesign. That's where I'm very careful. I've started trying to decipher between structure and cover. So structure, bank edges, drops, humps, and then cover is more of your anything, brush or all the different man-made stuff you can get that's more fishable. So I'm careful with the structure, especially on older ponds, digging down anymore to hit a sand lens or something like that could, jeopardize the integrity of holding water. The majority of your earth movers will recognize that. If they do get down, then plate back over it. But I've gotten to where I don't like to go beneath that original layer.
So now that you've retooled the bottom, this is a good chance to think about water quality for the future. If the lake needs to be limed, especially if it's completely dry, it's real easy to get a spreader truck out there. But even when it's down like that, you have a lot less surface area you need to move lime out with a barge. You can spread the rest with a spreader truck around the edges. And if you think you're going to fertilize, now I know fertilization again is a whole topic in and of itself. If people do think that they're going to fertilize to improve productivity, then this is a chance to build fertilizer platforms if you're going to use a granular fertilizer, or think about how to apply that fertilizer before you fill the pond back up with water. So think about these things. If you want a dock, if you want a pier, if you want a boat ramp, while you got it down, it's a whole lot easier to build it than once it's full.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You may want to touch in on the alkalinity and pH. The way the alkalinity buffers that pH for pH swings and catchability in fish. Rather than just liming so you can fertilize and get a bloom and grow more fish, I push the lime component just so we can buffer that pH to make it, more comfortable, more, I think Bob got happy water. So we have more happy water, and happy water to me makes for a better bite. That when you've got that pH swinging from 6 to 8, those are stress fish. You've got to time it just right.
Yes, absolutely. Alkalinity is the measure of the calcium carbonate in the soils. The carbonate in the calcium carbonate is the buffering capacity of the water. So anytime an animal or a plant takes in oxygen and breathes out carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide joins with the water and tries to make carbonic acid. And if you have a lot of carbonate, it accepts that acid hydrogen ion and it buffers the water so you don't get a pH swing. The problem is if you have very low alkalinity and you've got plants respiring and fish respiring and photosynthesis happening in the day but not at night, you tend to see the pH of the water drop all night long as more and more carbon dioxide is being released and oxygen is being taken out of the water, and then go up in the daytime when you have photosynthesis going on and oxygen is being produced and carbon dioxide is being taken out of the water. I've seen lakes go from as much as 5 in the early morning up to a 10 in late afternoon. And the typical largemouth bass adult can survive that, but eggs don't, fry don't, and it stresses the fish out. The easiest way to think about this is if you've ever gone to a county fair, won a goldfish, brought it home, and the only water you had was distilled water. People are always surprised when I tell them fish cannot live in pure water. Fish like clean water, but they cannot live in pure water. If you take a fish, you take that goldfish, you bring it home, you put it in distilled water, in a few days it's going to be belly up because there's no salts at all in that water, and that fish is constantly stressed out because there's salt in its blood goes through its gills, salt's always trying to leave the fish, and the water's always trying to come into the fish to try to balance out that salinity, and the fish has to fight it, and they stress out. So a lot of times, maybe December to about April, we see fish kills happen that are not oxygen related. They're usually water chemistry related because they're ponds with low alkalinity. The fish are stressed out. It doesn't kill the fish, but the fish get secondary infections. They get fungal infections or bacterial infections because of that stress. And a stressed fish is not a fish that's growing. It's not a fish that's biting. So it's not a happy water situation, like you said. So I think we've got our pond rebuilt. We've got the habitat in. I think it's time to fill it with water and to restock. And when you restock your pond, don't go to your neighbor's pond and catch some fish. It's always a good idea to seriously think about your objective when you pick the fish and think about the genetics of the fish you're getting and put the right ratio of predator and prey at the right times of year in to get that population started off in what we call balance. And now balance can mean different things. Balance can mean an all-purpose pond that's going to grow bass and bluegill of good sizes. But for a lot of folks these days, we're going to a prey-heavy stocking density where, Mark, I've always recommended 50 bass per acre and 500 brim per acre. What are you stocking?
It depends. Isn't that how you answer a question? It depends.
Yes.
If we've got the habitat and we've got the water, sometimes people will want to go with that higher ratio, 1,000 to 100. You start looking at growth rates, the 50 to 500, those growth rates are still through the roof. I am going a little heavier with initial bass stock now, just because I feel it's easier to pick out those jumpers, those big females that grow, so I can open that fishery up earlier than we used to. We'd wait till year 2 or 3, get the third generation. I like to pick out that first generation, those big females, that good genetic, and I'll open the fishery up in 18 months. After I get one getting ready for the next spawn, I'll protect those. So I feel going in at that heavier rate, you assume a ratio to male-female bass. You get 100, you assume 50 of each sex, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Okay, so that's, and then out of those females, we get what we always call jumpers, that good genetic. That little girl figured out what's going on, and she's getting big quick. She's outgrown her sisters. So I feel stocking at that higher rate with the bass, and bass are still running 50 cents an inch. I think it may be 75 cents an inch this year. But and you've got some leeway there to go heavier on bass. But then saying that, with your initial stock of bluegill, I want to get the biggest bluegill I can, 3 to 5 inch intermediates. if possible, I'll pay more for them because I know I'm going to get a spawn sooner than just going with 2 to 3 inches. Now, you got to have a trustworthy producer, somebody that'll haul that larger fish, and they're coming in healthy. They're going to acclimate your water not only for temperature but for pH. So whoever's watching or listening to this, whoever's hauling your fish, bringing them to you, if you ask them those questions and they dance, be careful with that, because that's a type of shock, and you have stressed fish that they may not die within a day or two, but they're sick and they'll have to overcome your natural bacteria and viruses in the water before they can carry on and take off.
You mentioned the females. We've had conversations in previous episodes about the fact that all trophy bass are female bass. You're not going to grow a male bass in the 8, 9, 10 pound range. It's just not going to happen. So if you can tell a male from a female, once they start spawning, you don't need that many males. You can harvest the males disproportionately to give your females a better shot. Because as we've discussed in previous episodes, the way to a trophy bass is through her stomach. So we've restocked, and so we followed proper stocking recommendations. We've got it restocked. Now the lake just needs to develop.
Let me plug a little bit on the restock. I like to go with a fathead minnow on my initial stock of bluegill, just to where those fathead minnows are prolific spawners. And those copper-nosed bluegill, and even your natives, they're so aggressive. I mean, a 5 or 6 inch bluegill, they're scarfing up. I mean, they've already switched from insects. They're ready for that fathead minnow, and they'll put on significant weight along with a supplemental feed. Even if you don't supplement feed, we've seen growth rates go side by side. And I'm a fan. I mean, I'm sold on feed too. There is a difference between 32% and 40% in vigor and growth rates. But I like that fathead minnow on new ponds, like a new stock in an old pond or renovation. But then after that, I stay away from the fathead minnow. That's just an expensive shot in the arm. And then your bluegill, and then your time frame of when to put those bass in. Some people wait till after substantial spawns from those bluegill, and some people even try to wait a year. There's different scenarios looking at the components of your pond to when that calendar is.
And just be careful if you do wait, because what you gain in an increased prey availability to the bass, you might lose in bass survival if it's too hot. So you don't want to be stocking in mid-July.
Along those same lines, those juvenile bass depend on the same thing that those juvenile bluegill need at a young age. So if your bluegill fill up your body of water real quick, then the nutrients may be limited for those young bass, and they may not jump like you expect.
And that growth that happens in the first year is so important. If they're not reaching their maximum potential within the first year, their ultimate potential is going to be reduced for their whole lifetime. You're not going to catch up. Would you agree?
Absolutely, to the point that if the budget allows on a new pond, I recommend feeding a better feed for your first 18 months. That if you get a larger bluegill, intermediate size, and you feed that the Aqua Pro MVP, pellet size, that I'm a fan.
So now that you've stocked it, you're feeding your pond, the fish are growing. The next thing is just don't fall into the same old traps. People just are afraid to kill a fish. They never want it. They think, well, that 11-inch bass, it's never going to be a trophy bass if I kill it now. But you have to kill small bass to free up resources for the bass that remain to grow bigger. Same is true with the bluegill. Episode 10 about the slab lab. I mean, they're taking out, I forget how many hundreds of pounds of 1 pound bluegill a year, the small bluegill that weigh a pound. Yeah. They're taking them out because that's the only way to free up those resources to get those bluegill to the next level, if that's your goal.
That larger bluegill, here in North Mississippi, we're going to get 4 to 5 spawns. I don't like to take bluegill out, but sometimes if you need to thin the herd, yes, keep that bigger, larger fish and just pull 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 of those big bulls, fast-growing bulls you get off the bed in May. And try to limit your big female harvest. because that's propping up your predator.
Good point. Let's take a new landowner, someone that just bought their property. They have a certain size pond on the property. It's been old and neglected. What are some of the first steps they should do?
First step, it starts with a site evaluation. What does it look like? Is it going to hold water? What does the dam look like? If there's water in the pond, is it noticeable that that water goes bad low during the summer? That's my number one when I first put eyes on the property. And then I look at a watershed boundary. If I can't get it off of your apps on your phone, your OnX and stuff that has that, you can get pretty close to it if those contours are enough. You get in the delta, you can't, but in the hills, sometimes if you can get a 5 or 10 foot contour, you can get your watershed area to know how much water flows through there. Then you can look at your outflow. If it's old, to see if the integrity is jeopardized there. So there's first 10 minutes, you're looking at that. And the clarity of the water. You mentioned the tannins. I'm looking for algal blooms, depending on what time of year. That'd be natural blooms. Hopefully the history, they would say if it's been fertilized. But that's what I'm looking at, any kind of nuisance weed. Next step, let's see what kind of bones this has. So I get a boat in it, and I'll start to scan it to see how deep it is. I like to scan, and while I'm mapping that, scanning for structure, for, brim beds, and getting a basic contour map. I mean, some of your depth finders now, mine's, portable. I'll strap it on any type of vessel, and it'll at least give me a 1 foot contour. And then I can get a capacity to where I could even start thinking of rotenone. How much would it take to kill this? I'm already getting options when we're on the water. And then poke the bottom to see if it's got a bunch of the muck, years of detritus and that organic, or is it a hard bottom? That's the first, hour or two of the visit. And in your basic water quality, just the portable alkalinity test to see where it is right now, alkalinity wise. I don't worry with pH. And then we start looking at fish. I'll compile as much history as I can. Fishing records, neighbors, did they fish it? What'd they catch? Start going from there.
Okay, Mark. Well, thanks for all that. Do you have any closing points for the audience before we wrap up today?
Absolutely, man. I just want to say that the reason, I'm so excited about this is we've got so many opportunities with these old ponds. Yeah, we hear about Pawpaw's Pond producing the big fish, but, land changes hands and different. As families move off, they move back and get that property. And too many times we think, well, you can't do much with it. It costs too much money. Well, actually, there's options out there. They don't have to break the bank. And the pieces of the puzzle hadn't changed since Swingle back at Auburn, about the predator-prey relationships. Don't give up on it. And if somebody says that it may not be doable, you may want to get that second opinion.
Mark, it was a lot of fun. Enjoyed talking with you, and maybe I'll have you on again to cover some of these other topics we kind of left on the table.
Be glad to. Absolutely.
And thanks everybody for joining Fish University. I'll see you next time. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.